Ladies and gentlemen, let me just briefly introduce our final speaker for the last part of this conference. I think there is not that much to mention. When I was a university student in political science and Islamic science, which I studied as a minor in Hamburg in the early 2000s, and we dealt with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and so on. And later, then, before I transferred as a German army officer to Afghanistan, the books that I studied to prepare myself for dealing with Al-Qaeda were the books of Peter Bergen, and I think that goes for many of those who showed interest in this particular topic of my generation. Therefore, I was very happy that we managed to bring you here to this conference. Peter, you volunteered to do the part which last year Nelly Lahoud did, trying to sum up all these different aspects and facts that came together here. Not an easy task, but we agreed that you just give some thoughts, some outlook, maybe some analysis from your point of view. Once again, thank you very much. The floor is yours, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Niels, and thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Issam Fares Institute. So, everything has been said, but not everything has been said by everyone. But I don't plan to simply recapitulate what has already been said. I plan to, you mentioned the word outlook, in the title of in the subtitle, we talk about the future of ISIL and Al-Qaeda, and we've had a lot of discussion, very good discussion, of regional issues. As an American, I've been rather, strangely, very little discussion of the United States, which after all is the main enemy for these groups. And that's quite refreshing, because often outside the United States there's a tendency to bash America for all sorts of good reason. And appropriately, today is the 15th anniversary of the Iraq War. And I don't think we'd be sitting in this room having this conversation, certainly not in the same way, if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq. In many ways, the original sin, and producing exactly the outcome the Bush administration claimed it was trying to prevent, which is an alliance between the Saddam regime and Al-Qaeda, which didn't exist before 9/11, and of course came to existence with the birth of ISIS. So I want to do a little bit of history, really big history, and also talk about the future. Of course, making predictions about the future is not easy because the future is surprising, but I'll try. So some broader historical observations. Shortly after 9/11, an American political scientist called David Rappaport came out with a paper which I thought made a number of very interesting observations. And he basically said in the last century there have been 4 waves of terrorism, and that after about a generation they burn out. The first wave was the anarchist wave. Of course, they killed President McKinley, an American president, in 1901. In 1920, they detonated what was probably the first VBID, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, on Wall Street, killing 38 people. You can still see the bank where the bomb blew up. You can still see the marks in the marble where the bomb took out chunks of the building at the corner of Wall Street. Anarchism burned out because ultimately anarchism wasn't really offering very much by definition. It didn't really have a set of ideas that were particularly attractive. The second wave was the anti-colonial wave. Now, this is actually one of the few waves of terrorism that actually achieved its goals. So the French in Algeria, the Jewish terrorist groups like the Bergen in Palestine that pushed the British out of Palestine after World War II. The Irish in in Ireland got the British to essentially withdraw, not completely, but largely from Ireland. And this wave burned itself out because it achieved its goals. The next wave was the Marxist wave, the Brigati Rossi, the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Weather Underground in the United States, the Black Panthers, the Red Army faction. This wave burned it out because Marxism as a set of ideas wasn't particularly attractive, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it just, that was it. And then we had the religious wave, and it's the wave that we're still in, which began in 1979 with events that we're all very familiar with, the overthrow of a secular American-backed dictator in Iran, which was greatly appealing to a young man called Osama bin Laden, even though it was a Shia uprising. At age 17, he saw this as a very interesting model. And similarly with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was just a little bit older, but in Egypt at the same time observing this revolution. And then, of course, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on December 27th, 1979, which produced all the things that we know about the Afghan jihad. You also had the attack on the Mecca shrine by sort of essentially Wahhabists, militant Wahhabists in Mecca in the same year. So we're still in the religious wave. Now, if we'd had this discussion back in shortly after the death of bin Laden and the rise of the Arab Spring, I would have had a very optimistic view of all this, because Al-Qaeda Central, the group that attacked the United States on 9/11, was essentially over. The Arab Spring was conducted without bin Laden's ideas or personnel, and as Ann Sternson mentioned with the documents in the compound, I mean, I think he knew very well that this was exactly what he wanted, which is regime change in the Middle East, but it didn't have anything to do with his ideas or his personnel, and it kind of caused him, he wanted to take advantage of it, but I think it caused him some paralysis as he sat in his compound and about and thought about it. But now, of course, the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter, and it provided a huge opportunity for these groups. And so I'm I'm by nature not a pessimist, but I am pessimistic about the future of this religious wave, because anarchism can die because it's a bad set of ideas. Anti-colonial terrorism can die because it achieves its goals. Marxist terrorism can die because the Soviet Union's out of business. You can't abolish God. And for the people that are involved in these groups, they truly believe that God is on their side. And there's been much discussion about why people join these groups, and a lot of very fruitful and interesting, and there's no simple answer, of course, but religion is obviously part of it. And since you can't abolish God, and the conditions that produce these groups continue to exist, I think we will see a son of ISIS and a grandson of ISIS. And here's why. ISIS was never the problem. ISIS is a symptom of a set of other problems, and I think of them as being largely Middle Eastern and European, but something I've learned today, of course, is that they're also Central Asian. That I think was a very important point that I think Mr. Tucker brought up. So just to go through about 8 or 9 points about what are the political conditions that produce, right? And I'm being very careful when I say a Middle Eastern and European phenomenon. I'm not saying a Western phenomenon, because the United States and Australia and New Zealand and other Western countries don't really have this same issue. And why is that? They're countries built on immigration. Now, I come from the United States, and we have something called the American Dream. Now, the American Dream has worked very well for every generation of immigrants into the United States, and Muslim immigrants are no exception. So in the United States, a Muslim immigrant doesn't live in a ghetto, has the same average education as the average American, has the same average income. Now, everything I've just said is completely untrue in Europe, more or less entirely. I mean, obviously, London has a Muslim mayor, and there are kind of exceptions that you can kind of produce. But the main point is if you're a Muslim living in France, you are living in a situation that's very different than your American counterpart. So I'll lay out in a little bit more detail what I mean by that, and I thought what Bernard Rougier had to say on this was very important. But so let me start with the Middle East. So if you accept the idea, tell me where I'm wrong. The conditions that produced ISIS continue to exist. Now, we're going to have an election in Iraq on May 12th, and if it goes reasonably well, Iraq, for the first time in many, many years, has a chance of sort of muddling through. I was in Iraq in December. It was the first time that I've ever felt that Iraq had a better chance than Afghanistan. Usually it's the other way around. But that, one piece of good news doesn't maketh not peace in the Middle East. And the big problem, I think, is a sectarian civil war that is engulfing the Middle East with very deep pockets on both sides, whether it's the Iranians or the Gulf states. And, what's fascinating to me, having been studying this for a long time, and Osama bin Laden never talked about the Shia. And what did he talk about? I mean, he talked about the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. He also talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm not an expert on jihadi propaganda, but my strong impression is that there is very little discussion of what used to be the central issue, and now it's all about the Shia. So, obviously it's a long-standing dispute with people with deep pockets who have no interest in making it better. In fact, the people who could make this better are precisely the people who are driving it forward. So think about Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. He executed Nimr al-Nimr, the leading Shia cleric, in Saudi Arabia for absolutely no reason at all, except that he happened to be a bleeding Shia cleric who made some very anodyne statements. And so problem number one is you have this sectarian war that has consumed Yemen and Syria and Iraq and shows very little sign of abating, and by the way, has now spread to countries like Afghanistan. Anti-Shia attacks are routine in Afghanistan now in a way that was not the case at all a few years back. The second problem is the collapse of Arab governance, and since we're in an academic environment, we can refer to Hobbes. And so, Hobbes wrote Leviathan in 1651, and he wrote it at the end of the English Civil War, and he made the very obvious point that the only thing worse than a dictator was anarchy. And so we've run two political science experiments with exactly the same outcome, interestingly, we, the United States. The first one was overthrowing Saddam and producing anarchy in Iraq, and then Obama did exactly the same thing in Libya. And producing anarchy in Libya and two governments, and UAE is bombing there, Egypt is bombing there, maybe even the French are bombing there. There's a whole panoply of players that are kind of in the Libyan war right now. So the collapse of Arab governance is another factor here, because as we've heard from a variety of people, in a sense, the weaker the Muslim state, it's not the, I think the person who presented on Boko Haram, it was you, sir, Colonel, you said rightly that Boko Haram, it's not the strength of Boko Haram, it's the weakness of the Nigerian military. And so, there's a political law which is the weaker the state is in the Muslim world, the stronger these groups are, not because they're strong, but because their hosts are weak. And so with this kind of collapse in Arab governance that we've seen in Yemen, Libya, other countries, we've created more opportunities for these groups. The third problem is Arab economics. I'm not saying that economics, bad economies generate terrorists as a sort of matter of course, because plenty of terrorists, particularly leaders, are well off. But when you look at insurgencies, often the people are drawing a paycheck, and they are attracted to these groups because there is a sort of economic opportunity in joining the Taliban or ISIS. And so if you go back to the Arab Spring, youth unemployment during the Arab Spring was 27%, and now youth unemployment during the Arab Spring in the Middle East is 30%. This, of course, problems 1, 2, and 3 have created problem 4, which is the unprecedented wave of immigration from the Muslim world into Europe. And so, obviously in Germany, 1 million Muslims came as refugees or asylum seekers. European countries are just not equipped to deal with this from an ideological perspective. Going back to the question of the American dream, there is no British dream, French dream, German dream, EU dream that I'm aware of. There's no ideological apparatus to make these people become part of the countries that they're in. And I'm not saying that occasionally, yes, there are people getting integrated, and there are plenty of successful Muslims in Europe. But as a general matter, if you are a Muslim in France, a very striking statistic to me is 8% of the French population is Muslim, yet an astonishing 60% of their prison population estimated is Muslim. By way of contrast, in the United States, where African Americans are, there's a long history of discrimination. 12% of the population is African American, 40% of the prison population. So the French are doing a much even worse job than the United States has done in terms of the African American population to their Muslim population. And that story is also true in Belgium, where I think 6% of the population is Muslim, but 30% of their prison population is Muslim. So it is deeply unsurprising that everybody involved in the Paris and Brussels attacks had been through the French and Belgian prison systems. Then you add to that toxic mix the rise of ultra-nationalist and proto-fascist parties in Europe. These groups used to be very marginal, and now they're either running the country or they're the second group, second party in the country, whether it's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or Marine Le Pen in France, or the Orbán in Hungary, or the right-wing government in Poland. So these parties used to be marginal, but now they're at the center, and of course they're based on this anti-immigration sentiment. And then you add to this what various people have described today about the sort of rise of militant Salafism, and then you add to that social media, which intensifies all these trends, and you have a kind of, I think, pretty toxic kind of set of conditions that will continue to generate the kinds of Europeans who will be attracted to these jihadist militant ideas, and the kinds of conditions in the Middle East that will keep generating these groups. So that's my sort of, unfortunate, not prediction, but at least sort of laying out of the basic underlying currents that I think will continue to produce these kinds of organizations. So having said all that, I wanted to address just a little bit about, there was a lot of discussion that I did want to touch on in the last couple of days about why people join these groups. And I think it's blindingly obvious that, Tip O'Neill famously said that all politics is local. All jihad is local. I mean, the reason why people will join these groups differs from place to place. I mean, I just recently wrote a book about why Americans have joined the jihad. And, there's no particular one-size-fits-all description. And even in one family, the Sarniev family, so Jahar Sarniev was the younger brother in the Boston Marathon attack, and Tamerlan was the older brother. Now, Tamerlan was a very observant Salafist Muslim. His brother was smoking pot and drinking whiskey and chasing girls and behaving like the very average American college student he was, and probably knows less about Islam than most of the people in this room. And yet, they together conducted this attack. And the more I found, the more that you tried, you mentioned this anthropological look that when you were looking at the Kazakhs. I mean, I found the more you knew about a case, the less you knew about their motivations. And in fact, when it came to Tamerlan, Jahar Sarniev trying to explain himself, his explanation of why he did what he did was really very unsatisfactory. And this may, as a philosophical matter, get to the nature of evil, but which is that it's hard, at a certain point, you can explain it up to a point, but the murder of innocent strangers is not easily explicable. And as the one thing that I saw in common with a lot of and they're mostly men, that when I was looking into it was they wanted to be heroes in their own story. This is essentially what they wanted to be. And, mostly they were not heroes. I mean, Tamerlan Sarniev, at the time of the Boston Marathon attack, was unemployed, unemployable. He was basically living off his wife's earning, she was working 80 hours a week. He was somewhere going nowhere. And, he had dreams of being an Olympic-level boxer. They had faded. Suddenly he's once again a hero in his own story by carrying out this attack. Similarly, Major Nadar Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, Texas, he printed up business cards which said SOA at the bottom, Soldier of Allah, which is not a typical, he's an American Army major, not a typical thing you put on your business card if you're an American military officer. And on the face, he was a very observant Muslim. And on the face of it, it looked like, in his own mind, he carried out this heroic Mujahideen, kind of Fedayeen attack. But I talked to his double first cousin. His double first cousin is genetically like a brother. And his double first cousin voted Republican, drinks beer, plays golf, voted for George W. Bush. And spent a lot, and they grew up as brothers, and they could not have come out more differently. And the double first cousin, who lives in Arlington, Virginia, where they were both born, and they're totally American, said, the problem about his double first cousin was that he was unmarriageable, unmarried. His parents had died early. He had no friends. He was deathly afraid of deploying to Afghanistan, and he did this attack as a way of getting out of essentially his personal problems and emerging from it as a hero. So when I looked at the cases again and again, I found that there was this desire to be a hero in your own story. But I also found that making generalizations of any kind really made no sense. And I found that the quotation from Immanuel Kant to be a very useful reminder to historians, journalists, researchers, which is, from the crooked timber of humanity, not a straight thing is made, from which I take to mean that, we're all, blindingly obviously, each person is so particular that to try and make sort of generalizable deductions about why people go out and kill innocent strangers is very hard. And and that sounds like a cop-out. But after spending 2.5 years looking into it, I became more convinced that was the case. So, looking forward a bit, maybe I have a few minutes here, right? Since we've discussed not much about the United States. I wanted to, and ultimately that was Al-Qaeda's goal, was to, well, actually, before I get to that, ISIS has been defeated, and I think there's a reason for that, because ISIS had an incoherent strategy. And we tend to think of our enemies, and I presume everybody in this room would consider ISIS an enemy. We tend to, I think, or often, particularly politicians, tend to ascribe to our enemies much smarter stratagems than they actually have. I mean, Al-Qaeda on 9/11 had what it thought was a brilliant idea, which was to attack the United States so that we would pull out the Middle East. Well, that was the most, it was a tactical victory, but a strategic failure, because not only did we not pull out of the Middle East, the Nobel Prize winning President Obama conducted wars in 7 Muslim countries, subsequently Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Somalia. The United States is more engaged in the Middle East than it's ever been in its history, and we have huge bases in Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain, and we can continue 15 years later to be in Iraq and 17 years later to be in Afghanistan. So the point is that it failed totally. But because it was so surprising to particularly people in the Bush administration, that people we started describing, that there was, and Al-Qaeda itself kind of played along with this, that it was all part of a brilliant strategy to pull us into the Middle East and bleed us dry. Well, that was a post facto rationalization of a failed strategic approach. So similarly with ISIS, was defeated because it had 2 very incoherent goals. The first was establishing the caliphate. If it just stopped with that, I think ISIS would still be here, because it gained territory the size of the United Kingdom, population the size of Switzerland in the summer of 2014. But then it did something very stupid, which is by beheading on camera Jim Foley, which was the most. Pollsters look at which news stories do people pay the most attention to. It was the most paid attention to story of the past 5 years in the United States. Like 90% of Americans had seen this story and heard about it. Of course, it provoked outrage. And so the US-led coalition, which had already started attacking ISIS because of the impending genocide of the Yazidis, became much bigger. And then, of course, when you add the burning the Jordanian pilot, that got the Arabs involved. And so the incoherence of the strategy was by creating a caliphate, which ultimately I think a lot of people would have lived with, but then attacking Western targets and other Arab targets, and then at one point attacking targets in Turkey. Now, Turkey invaded Syria, and the Turkish army is not a militia group. It's close air support and tanks, and took a vast chunk of ISIS-controlled territory away. So ISIS's strategy was basically incoherent, and I think most of these groups do have kind of incoherent strategies. They don't, it's highly unlikely that the goal of whatever the son of ISIS or the grandson of ISIS of creating whatever they want is likely to happen, because they tend to make a world of enemies. And basically, it's like Napoleon in 1814, which is you make a world of enemies. They're going to kind of, they're going to create a coalition to get rid of you. So somebody has said that these groups are learning organizations, and so what might the next iteration of the jihadists, what might they learn? Well, I think the first thing they will learn is to crowdsource jihad, which I think is an ISIS innovation. Al-Qaeda really functioned like Harvard. It was hard to get into, and it was an elite group. ISIS functioned like the US public school system, which is not hard to get into, and it takes everybody. And it did that, I think, for 2 reasons. First of all, it's running a major insurgency in the Middle East, and that required a lot of foot soldiers. And secondly, for them, it was important to, if you want lone wolf attacks in the West, this was kind of a good strategy. And Ann Sternson talked about the not referring to these people as lone wolves, which I agree with, because they are. Gabriel Wyman, who's an Israeli counterterrorism academic, he said a very clever thing, I thought, which is the lone wolf is part of a virtual pack. And so that the crowdsourcing of jihad is, I think, something we'll see in the next iteration, because these groups do learn from Americans, you don't have this problem here in this country, but school shootings in the United States are a big problem. School shooters study other school shooters before they carry out an attack. Terrorists study other terrorists. And so I think ISIS learned from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to inspire attacks in the West that it was not actually doing anything other than inspiring. And it had a magazine, of course, called Inspire, which became, I think, the basis for Dabiq in many ways, because it was written in colloquial English. It was something you might actually want to read. It was accessible. And then Anwar al-Awlaki also spoke in colloquial English and used the internet to radicalize people in the West. So ISIS took those innovations and made them part of their package of the tactics. So in addition to crowdsourcing jihad, I think we'll see that obviously everything that ISIS did on social media will be continued. The anti-Shiism and sectarianism will be continued. The role of women. This was unprecedented. There was no global, during the Afghan jihad, women were not involved, zero. During the Bosnian jihad, they were, there was no effort to reach out to women to be part of this. I would anticipate in the next iteration that will also be part of this. State building, I think we'll see, Dr. Hansen reminded us that, actually Shabab was doing some of this in Somalia, but whether it's AQAP, as Dr. Kendall pointed out, in Yemen, state building, obviously ISIS doing state building. We saw some version of that, I think, in Marawi in the Philippines with the ISIS affiliate there, so I would anticipate we'll see more of that. And then in terms of emerging trends, the use of TATP in all attacks in the West, it's every attack uses hydrogen peroxide-based bombs because it's easily accessible. Most, by the way, in the past, they didn't use these because hydrogen peroxide-based bombs are very unstable. But whether it's the Paris attacks or the Brussels attacks or other attacks in the West, we've seen hydrogen peroxide-based bombs being used. Vehicle attacks, we've had 15 vehicle attacks in the West by jihadists and 2 by right-wing terrorists, 1 in Charlottesville, Virginia, and 1 in London outside of Finsbury Park Mosque. We'll see more of those. The insider threat at airports, I think that's not going to go away because a lot of people work at airports and you can't, I don't know what the number would be, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And we've seen at Heathrow Airport, we've seen Al-Qaeda sympathizers even in the West, and obviously at airports like the one in Sinai where there's less good controls, you'll see this threat arise. Armed drones, I think, are a really big problem, which we've seen Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, use a submersible drone, interestingly, that was almost certainly given to them by the Iranians. ISIS using armed drones. Embassies around the world are well defended against truck bombs, but I don't think they're well defended against armed drones. So an attack on an embassy, a Western embassy with an armed drone is, I think, pretty likely. And then, what might social media do that it isn't doing already? Because if we'd gone back 10 years, we couldn't have predicted a world in which the people who did the Westgate attack in Kenya were live tweeting details of the attack as it was going down. People within Shabab, or at least on the fringes of Shabab, knew more about the attack. We're giving much better information than the Kenyan government, which are maybe a low bar, but the point is there was the first major terrorist attack that we saw social media being used as part of the kind of messaging during the attack. Well, one thing I think we might see is virtual training camps that are sort of accessible by social media, because virtual reality is now a pretty strong form of communication, and the costs of getting the kind of equipment is going down. So those are just some short observations on some emerging trends.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for your take on this topic and this the wrap-up or summary. That brings us to the end of this conference, and a few points I want to mention. I'm not going to sum up anything. First of all, thank you all for participating. Thanks to the speakers who came here for your thoughts and insights you offered. And I want to also thank my team members who took care about all the logistics, in particular Nawal El Seman and Patricia Abdul Karim. Thank you very much for handling all these things. A final thing that you told me that I would have to announce is a departure to the speakers' dinner tonight, 7 p.m. at the hotel lobby. For those who want to attend, we're looking forward to have you tonight. And if there is any other things to be clarified regarding logistics or your transfer, please don't hesitate and ask my staff members now. Thanks again. Hope to see you again. Thank you very much.